Hi, I'm Justin Kale, an economist, researcher, and connector of three worlds, academia, policy, and business, that don't talk to each other nearly enough. Welcome to From Ideas to Innovation, a podcast dedicated to providing in-depth conversations with academics, entrepreneurs, and policymakers who've been talking past each other for way too long.
The United States, from the end of the Civil War to World War II, but especially to World War I, has really fast economic growth by world standard. But that growth is highly uneven across the income distribution. Farmers don't get big raises in real incomes, and the people who get really rich are the top 1 or top 10%. Now, when you look at what economic historians end up studying, where they point out that there's actually really huge gain at the bottom.
Today, I was honored to have my good friend Vincent Geloso on. Vincent is the Wilson Schmidt Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University, and he obtained his PhD in economic history from the London School of Economics. He also used to be a postdoc research associate at Texas Tech University. He has over 120 peer-reviewed papers, and his research focuses on North American economic history, public choice, and income inequality. We had a great conversation about his work connecting economic history to today and his new forthcoming book, The Great Enrichment, a new story of American growth and inequality from 1865 to 1945. Well, Vincent, thank you for joining From Ideas to Innovation.
Pleasure to be here.
So, obviously, you're incredibly well accomplished. We're good friends. We've done a lot of work together. I'd like to think so. I don't know what you're going to think, but I'd like to think we're friends. Maybe colleagues, but, I would say friends. So obviously very well accomplished. I've done a bunch of, research across the spectrum. What made you decide to pursue economics as a career in the first place?
So it was largely an accident. I wanted to study either psychology or art history, and art history was at the top of my list. And I remember a conversation with my father who said something along the lines of, you can do it. You won't get paid, but you can find jobs that will pay you, and then you can do it out of the money you get. And that was one of my dad's better moments of the many good moments. I'm not a diss against my dad, but he basically made me realize that there was a distinction between a hobby and a job. And then I hesitated between psychology which is my mother's profession, and economics. And for reasons that still elude me today, I decided to pick economics. And since then, I realized that economics would be my hobby in a way that actually is pretty cool, because I get to study things that are utterly fascinating, in my opinion, and I get paid for it, which is really goddamn sweet.
You get paid to do things you like. That's a good. I feel the same way. I understand that completely. So you've done a bunch of other work, right? But you really kind of got started and cut your teeth in economic history. So what was interesting to you about economic history? Was there a specific book or paper or person?
No, like a lot of people, it was a professor. So at the University of Montreal, where I did my undergrad, in if I remember the joke, one of our somebody we work with, Ben Powell, once said, in Canada stand, to make the joke that he made. I don't think if it was Ben or somebody else, but anyway, someone made the joke. So when I was in Canada stand at the University of Montreal, I first started wanting to do politics. Then I dabbled in journalism, where I interned for a year. So my first summer job was in the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa. Since back then I was a member of the Conservative Party, and I was one of the 5 people inside the party who spoke French and was from Quebec. So they liked me for purely that reason. I fully admit that it was entirely positive discrimination in favor of the Frenchies. So it's
very rare.
Very rare, very, very rare. So, but no, I had fun, but I realized that wasn't for me. I didn't like politics as much as I thought I would. I was far too idealistic. Then I dabbled in journalism for a year, and I was completely clueless about what I wanted to do. And one of the classes for the 2 years, and our undergrads in Montreal are 3 years, not 4. So in my third year, which means my last one, I had no clue what I wanted to do after undergrad. And I had a class that I had kept delaying, was Leonard Dudley's Economic History of the Western World. And I just wanted to delay it. I wasn't interested. I was like, I don't care. It's like history by economists who, and and then I had this professor, Leonard Dudley, who was utterly amazing. One of the best professors. I still refer people to his work now because his class was entirely enlightening. After I think like a quarter of the semester, I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, and I wanted to do only economic history because that was badass.
Hmm.
And from there, it was easy going forward. And it was this man, Leonard Dudley. If ever people are interested, he wrote pretty cool articles on the why is France the shape of an hexagon? Uh, and it's basically an economic history of state unification, and it's a spatial economics theory of state formation. He has work on standardization of languages and in relation to human capital. So he worked a lot on like what was the effect of the Latin language on trade in Europe. And he had work also on the Industrial Revolution in Britain, where he looks at what happens when vernaculars facilitated trade. And he was basically constructing in a very somewhat different language and transaction costs. He was saying, what if we mention the cost of understanding each other, and thus language, essentially, as part of transaction costs? And from this, I was like, this is pretty cool. Like, we can use language to understand the past and like explain big events, and I was hooked. And from there, again, as soon as I made up my mind that this was what I wanted to do and I had like a gut feeling about it, it was really easy to keep going.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And I had basically the same story. I had no idea what I wanted to do whenever it was kind of getting close to graduation. I was probably first semester in my senior year, and I was kind of thinking like, what the hell am I going to do? And I had a few econ professors who I really liked. All of the econ professors I had at Loyola were really great, and I liked them.
Blockhead.
And I remember Walter Block, Leo Krasnashan, John Levindus, Bill Barnett were all fantastic. I remember going up to essentially all of them, and I said, well, your job seems pretty cool. How do I do your job? And the answer was, you got to take more math classes and go get a PhD in economics. So I said, okay. And then, did that,
It's
took the more
funny.
math classes.
It's funny you say that because there's a story I remember now from Ben Powell at Texas Tech, where another economic historian, Richard Vedder, who's a very good economic historian, wrote a very good work, notably something that's worth reading, Out of Work, which is one of the best uh, underappreciated work on unemployment in the United States and the relation of government policies to this. But at one presentation that Ben saw, he saw this professor, and by that point, his hair would basically curl in the other direction. So he had the McDonald arch on his head, and he was a bit chubby, and he'd spit everywhere. And he would say stuff like, "Sweatshop, sweatshop. I love sweatshops. They lift the poor out of poverty." And I remember Ben saying, "I wanted to be that guy." so so kind of testimony that there's a lot of people who start their career with professors that are maybe not the most, like, they're not rock stars, but they look like they're having fun, and goddamn, I want to have fun too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, you get paid to do, to read and write about interesting things that you find interesting. Like
Yep.
it's an incredible career. I mean, it really is. It's very special. So I've heard you talk about, obviously, you do a lot of economic history, and I've heard you talk a lot about how to do economic history well versus not as well when it comes to informing us about the present. What would you say is that distinction?
So economic historians are basically economists who can talk to historians, and historians who can talk to economists. It's a weird bastard, if you want to think about it like a mutt, where you basically have to speak two languages that are entirely different. Um, the language of the economist is that of theoretical predictions, models that guide through the night, that allow you to understand how people make choices, to understand human action. So you need the economics to kind of navigate the past. But at the same time, good economists understand that, like, when we say people maximize under constraint, what the are the constraints? Right? It's like people's constraint need to be understood, and that means you need to talk what the historians are able to talk about, which understand people's settings, understand the source material, understand what people's choices actually were, so you can actually understand the economic problem they faced. So if you're able to do the two things, it's really, really productive. The difficulty at this is it's not an easily acquired art. The practice of mixing two disciplines like this requires years of effort. So I remember initially for the first 4 years of my PhD, spent years in archives, years understanding how to use primary sources, how to look for them, how to organize around it. And I had like very low output as a graduate student. But once the fixed cost was paid, well, marginal cost kept falling. So I started producing more and more. And so when like people tell me, oh, you've been very productive, and it's like, yeah, but it's easy. I paid like a high fixed cost at the beginning of skill acquisition and data accumulation and understanding the source materials. And I identified papers that I thought were worth doing. Now my marginal costs are much lower than everybody as long as I stay in that domain. And I haven't like fully finished this, but a good economic historian has this ability to navigate those two very different worlds. And I say people can do some economic history, but it's not, oh, I downloaded a database off the internet and then I ran some regression or I made some structural estimations of X or Y model. You're looking at the past, but you're not doing history per se. The history part requires like an extra, I'm going to sound a bit Marxist, you need a bit more effort to qualify as economic historian. I find it's a bit trivial, but in terms of what needs to be done is you can't just say, I took a data set and the data set started in 1700. That means,
therefore I'm an economic historian.
yeah, there's something more. There's an extra set of qualifications that you require to go there. But some people are much better at it than others. For example, I think Joel Mokyr, who won the Nobel last year now, I want to say, was definitely one of those persons that just probably had an intuitive understanding of doing both things at once. And well, definitely was better than I am at all of this. Understood very well how to mix the sources, how to mix the past and the present of the theory, and going back in time, which, if again people are interested, one of his best books is one of his least known book, which is Why Ireland Starved. It's basically an exploration of Ireland before the Great Famine. And it challenged a lot of things, and it showed also, by the way, that if you do good economic theory, you can change a lot of interpretation about the past, some of which then seep into modern conversations that are still in the background for reasons of cultural commemoration or shared legacies, etc.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. So, what would you say is the most common mistake that people make when they try to like look into the past to make present day arguments? Because obviously, like looking to the past to inform today is interesting and important on its own, but obviously can be done poorly. So, what is like one common mistake you kind of see across the board, whether that's actual in economics or historian research, or just kind of in layman's terms of when people are talking about the history?
Being too anchored in the present. So very often the world we observe around us now gives us reference points, and thus we often expect the past to look just like a backward version of now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's generally very wrong. So for example, I'll take the example of schooling. People tend to think of, if you say schools, what people think of now is you basically sit your asses on benches and you listen to a professor for many hours. And that schooling is also human capital. But if you go back in time, that's not it. Human capital back then was very different. So it's learning another language. So for example, if you were a French speaker in Canada and you learned English, that was the equivalent of going to school in terms of extra returns on wages. It was the equivalent of going to school 1.5 years extra. So that's human capital. Industrial education, what you would learn on the job with employers training you to acquire certain particular skills that are very specific, hard to transfer to other jobs, but very specific. Correspondence schools did the same things, very rarely mentioned. Circulating libraries, which used to be like libraries where people would pay for the book entirely before, but only as a deposit, and they'd pay an annual membership on addition. But these books were then read in communal centers and were ways to teach people about how to read and write. All of these ways that are not visible to us today because they don't matter that much. Nobody has a circulating library anymore, or industrial education is no longer that much of a thing. Socialists, by the way, this is something cool in history. The biggest fan of industrial education were socialists at the turn of the 19th century. They loved it because that was a way to turn around the system that where the public schools apparently were meant to preserve the capitalist system. And if you taught the workers in the factories or around the factories, you could reprogram them to be anti-capitalist. So that's where they were taught horrible ideas, but it is a form of human capital where you had schooling on the side that was provided by other reasons. And this is totally forgotten today. That's because when we go back in history, we expect to see the same thing as today, but scaled down or scaled up, depending on what you think the variable is. But that's the wrong way to think about it, is you have to kind of you have to find a way to break some of your connections to the present so that you're less chained to what you expect to see. And that gives me way to very often the criticisms I make of people who go and do economic history is very often they haven't broken these chains and they don't see the very obvious thing next to them in the source material. So if you look like anything that I've criticized over the year, notably Thomas Piketty, is he expects, for example, tax evasion to be at the top of the income distribution, which is plausibly true today. But back then, that wasn't true. And on the same document that he cites to make his arguments, the page after says, oh, yeah, most of the tax evasion is done by poor people, which is not something you expect.
Which makes sense. I mean, back in the day, I'm just thinking about it kind of in modern terms. We think about this in terms of like the formal versus informal markets, and who are the most, usually in the informal markets are often people at the bottom of the income distribution. And by necessity, or by definition, them being informal means it's probably not accurately reported and there's tax evasion going on. So if you just, back up all the way to history, the same trend makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So,
yep.
And we'll get to Piketty more later. Don't you worry.
I don't, but I'm not trying to rip on him as a point of honor, but more as a point of example that it's very easy to do that. And I think I've fallen prey to this danger multiple times where I've revisited some of my own work saying, oh man, this is actually, my result would have been stronger. My result would have been weaker if I'd accounted for this very different way. But I think this is the key part, is you have to unshackle yourself from the present when you explore the past, but don't break the chains entirely, because at one point you got to bring it back to today. So it's a hard game to play, and that's why I also said it's a bit of an art, thus requiring practice.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, then the art history you were interested in, kind of, made its way here. So, last question on you, then we'll get to the book itself. But you've had a obviously prolific career. You've published over 120 articles, peer-reviewed articles. How do you do it? And what advice would you give to early career academics or graduate students?
So the first thing is find a domain where the fixed costs may be high, but the marginal costs keep falling. That's the first thing. Sorry to describe a natural monopoly to you, but that's what it is. That's what I've described. This is find something that you find easy to do, and the more you do it, the better you become at it. And in addition, you can get minimal competition within your domain, maybe be complementary to others. That's the first thing. And then the other thing is just as a work ethic, what kills you is not working slow or low productivity, or it's the days you don't work. So people expect that you have to do a paper very well in a day. And that's technically, it happens that I can write up a paper in a day. But that's because I've been thinking about that paper for years, and I've been assembling notes, and I've given it time to marinate. But every day, I take a little note somewhere, I leave it in my files, and I assemble the thoughts, and then I read other stuff. And it's basically, the rule is every day I have to write for 3 hours. Regardless of what is the quality of that writing, I have to do a little every day. And the virtue of this is it accumulates. And eventually, don't throw away inputs. Leave them as you would in a workshop. You keep some pieces because you might use them later. Don't throw anything away, which is why I also collect books somewhat maddeningly.
We could all tell from your background.
Yeah, no, but it's part of the job. I see something, I'm like, that could be interesting for this paper. That could be interesting for this paper, and there's always multiple ideas that are basically boiling in my head at the same time. But I always have like 50 papers. I'm exaggerating the number, but like they're always ongoing. It's just I know that there's more that's to be required to finish them, but keeping them active in my head. When I finish one, I get ideas for the others. They're connected. An input for one becomes an input for another. That's one way you keep the marginal cost down. But the only way you can do this is if you do a little work every day. Like you impose yourself a minimum amount of work and you keep mind of your other stuff. But afterwards, it's basically, you think about it this way. What kills you is the days you don't work. That's it.
Yeah.
It's not like how well you work when you do it. You could have a lot of false starts, but just even simpler than what I've just said. Tortoise in the hare. Tortoise always wins.
Yeah. And even if you go in the wrong direction, let's say, like you spend a day working on something and it doesn't go, it ends up not working out, or it doesn't go in the direction you thought it was going to go, or the way you were thinking about it, the more you learn, the more you realize, okay, maybe it means it's leaning me more to this direction or this research question. Well, even a lot of people would say like, like I didn't actually get any writing done today. Well, you did a lot of work that got you to the point of a better finished product elsewhere.
Worst case, there's stuff you throw and you're like, yeah, that didn't work. Well, what doesn't work is really a good start. It's a good way forward.
It's how I treated internships. It made me realize what I didn't want to do.
Yeah, it's there. This is why there's I like it as a mathematical tool, but vector error correction models, they're very helpful in econometrics, and they make perfect sense as economic logic. Is people correct errors?
Yeah, exactly. So let's get to the book, The Great Enrichment. So I first want to start with just the title, because everyone's heard of the Gilded Age, whether that's just through history or the new TV show. And people, point to robber barons or exploited workers, this monopoly man type villain. And you're arguing that that story is basically wrong. So succinctly put, what is the version of what actually happened?
So I think I need to set up the story just to have like a few more details. What I call the usual story is somewhat the following. The United States, from the end of the Civil War to World War II, but especially to World War I, has really fast economic growth by world standard. But that growth is highly uneven across the income distribution. Farmers don't get big raises in real incomes. Industrial workers get like pittances. And the people who get really rich are the top 1 or top 10%. Now, when you look at like what economic historians end up studying, so that's the high school version, what people used to say in the profession, there's the usual story light, where they point out that there's actually really huge gain at the bottom. There's huger gains at the top, and it's mostly for the top 1%, not the top 90th to 99th. It's like the really big wins are at the bottom and at the top 10. Point of the book is say both versions, both the light and the classical, are wrong in that we miss, through data problems, a large share of the gains that the poor benefited, and we somewhat overestimate the gains that the rich obtained. So much so that the period from 1870 to 1910, living standards for the bottom 90% of American increases in excess of 2.5% a year, which is really fast, and which is roughly on par with the top 1% and the top 10 to 99. So the in between the bottom 90 and the top 1, they actually get still pretty large increases, but much slower than everybody else. So it's basically like a great compression in living standard where the very bottom catch up massively to the rest of the income distribution.
Mm-hmm. So that actually leads me perfectly to the next question I was thinking, which is you separate, the normal measures of income inequality from what you call living standards inequality. And for a listener or someone who's just never made that distinction or still after hearing it doesn't really understand the distinction, what is that distinction and why does that actually matter?
So, for example, if I give you an extra year to live, that has value to you. Living longer, spending more time with your kids if you have them, spending more time with families and friends, just the extra income from that extra year, it has value to individuals. The income that you get every year will miss some of these gains in well-being. Hence why I make the distinction between living standards and income. And the exercise of the book is always to try and find ways to price in the value of other improvements or to reflect improvements that are missed or data problems. So, for example, one of the chapters of the book deals with the fact that in the period from 1870 to 1910, there's a huge reduction in inequality in lifespans. So if you take a life table is basically what's your probability of dying at any given age. And you can see that even above age 10, because a huge share of the reduction in mortality in that period is from infants not dying, which, has value.
Yeah.
But even above age 10, so people who make it past childhood and into teenage years, even they see improvements in their mortality rates in the sense that they fall. And the inequality in life expectancy past age 10 collapses over time by roughly half. Now, that alone will reduce lifetime income inequality, even if there is pure independence between your income and your life expectancy. As soon as you introduce the correlation between income and life expectancy, then the effect is even stronger, largely because, the rich may get an extra year of life, but the poor, if he gets like 1 or 2 extra years, it matters far more to him. So one of the things I do in the book is I say, okay, let's try and calculate the value of these extra years of life by using either just the extra income or what economists call the value of a statistical life, which is how much people value living. And we have ways of doing this when they pay for trade-offs of jobs that are riskier than others, and because the job is riskier, the wage premium that they get relative to a less risky job, the extra probability of dying on the job gives you an idea of the valuation of life that workers give implicitly. It's a roundabout way to measure this. So one is just the extra income is the low bound, the value of a statistical life is the high bound. And what I say is I create a hypothetical scenario where I imagine, okay, there's an angel that drops from the sky. You were a worker born in 1870. You were told you were going to live till 1910 when you were age 10 in 1970. So you get to live to 50. And now the angel comes in and says, you'll live to 55. I can offer you a choice. You live to 55 rather than 50, or I kill you at 50, which is a weird thought experiment, but I compensate you for this. So I give you an annuity equal to the present value of the extra income. Yeah. How much is this worth? So how much am I changing the income of this that's not measured in the worker's income in 1910 or something like this? And what you get is this is worth 0.4 or 0.5 extra percentage point in growth for the bottom 90%. So it matters. So this is one of the things I do is this is measuring living standards quite directly, because you're saying the income is going to miss all of these other dimensions of the quality of life. And notably the fact that just living longer means you have more lifetime income. No crap. Especially if you live much shorter lives than the rich, you catch up to them in lifetime income in ways that the snapshot income in each year misses.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a ton of sense. And both here and obviously in work we've done together and work you've done elsewhere, is that you point to kind of what I consider to be very normal barriers for opportunity and mobility, like open markets, freedom to move, low barriers to starting a business. And that's kind of the real engine of growth in some of these standards of living that you're seeing. What was different about America at that time that let ordinary people cash in?
So the simple overview answer is open markets. So the point I've been trying to make for years is people underestimate how much of an egalitarian force markets are. Markets are highly impersonal in a way, and people think that's bad. But this impersonality doesn't mean that more than markets don't care where you're from as long as you produce value to others through exchange. So if your skills are valuable to somebody else and you're poor, markets don't give a crap that you were born poor. Your status doesn't matter to profit seeking. And so what you need to check is, okay, so can people be matched to their best possible ways of doing skills? And that means the capacity to enter the market in which they're most talented. So if I'm good at being economics, what I want to do at being an economist, what we want to check is, are there barriers to entering that market? There could be natural barriers, those that exist just through technological features, but there could also be legal barriers. And the reality is the United States, it wasn't flawless in the second regard, but it was still much better than a lot of other places. Markets were easily contestable. Incumbents could be challenged. Even natural monopolies, things that we call natural monopolies, actually look somewhat competitive, very surprisingly. They're highly innovative industries. And one of the other effects that generates from this is you realize, so there's a famous paper by Bill Nordhaus that says 4%, or I think 1 to 4% of the gains from innovation go to the inventor and the innovating firm itself. The rest goes to the rest of the population in the form of higher wages, complementary services, longer lives, things that like value. And one of the example I point out is this actually will matter when you use, for example, deflators. So if I'm a firm, I invent a new good. That new good is railways that make food more easily accessible over long distances. Well, one of the effects is if I want to sell this on a mass scale, I also need to, get a large number of customers. So one of the effects of this is you look at inflation for the poor and inflation for the rich. The sectors that were highly innovative in the United States were showing massive price drops, and the massive price drops were for goods that featured very heavily in the baskets of the poor. So that meant that their price, the cost of living for them fell quite fast. And there's a dual effect to this, which is if workers become even more productive because firms are able to increase their productivity and boost up their wages, there is the other effect is it increases the cost of living for the rich. In that what the rich like to hire are unskilled poor people who do work as service people inside their house. And as long as the productivity of unskilled workers working as servants, essentially, inside a rich person's mansion, as long as that productivity doesn't increase as fast as the rest of the economy, the rich guy is just forced to pay higher and higher wages to keep the servants, and in doing so, has to hire fewer and fewer. That's because his cost of living goes up. So the process of economic development here had a two-sided effect. Is it increased the cost of living for the rich relative to the poor, and it actually made the cost of living of the poor fall in absolute terms. Combine all of these forces together, you get an egalitarian price trend. So that the hidden in the background, and this is work I did with Peter Linder that underlies the book, there's egalitarian inflation, or in that period, egalitarian deflation, where the price changes are pro-poor. And this is something I will add about the book. The book itself is relatively short. I tried to keep it short and not too technical, accessible to all. But there is an appendix that's as long as the book itself, as per usual contradiction. But one of the things I do in the book is I consistently veer towards the lower bound. I systematically use hypotheses that hurt my case and that America was highly egalitarian. And one of the things I did is I used the worst estimation of inflation and inequality, the one that would actually capture the least gains to the poor relative to the rich. If I loosen my case just a little towards anything between the lower bound and the higher bound, you get even more leveling, such that the cost of living for the poor fell so much in that period that it's a huge leveling force because it's pushing up their real incomes even more.
Yeah, and you're almost saying, like, because traditionally, at least when we think about it presently, we think about it typically, especially with the Cantillon effect, like inflation hurting the poor more. Here, obviously, you're seeing the opposite effect of, well, the deflation is actually helping the
but here
poor.
there's a difference. Cantillon effect, to clarify for those who don't know, this is basically when monetary injections by governments or changes in the money supply, doesn't have to be by government, doesn't enter the economy evenly, as per the
Right.
helicopter analogy that Friedman made, is that the entry point is somewhat distorted, and then it changes relative prices and people's perception until people figure it out and then return to the normal pattern. Here, it's productivity-led deflation. So it's certain sectors get huge innovations and their output increases out
Yeah.
of genuine reductions in costs. And so
Right.
that pattern changes relative prices, and the relative prices change in favor of the poor. Their goods get cheaper. The things that the rich consume in greater proportion actually get dearer. Services, for example, like servants. And by the way, you can also see that it coincides with the other data. Number of servants in the United States in that period, it collapses, which
Yeah.
is what the theory predicts.
Yeah. No, and like you said, like an example I like to give that, is the most back of the envelope calculation you can give, but I think is still interesting and important, is if you look at what Jeff Bezos' net worth is, and you look at what the market cap or the value of Amazon is, very different, right? Jeff Bezos captured, only a small percentage of that. And what was the good that we got out of it is tremendous, right? We get,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I get things now shipped to my house like same day sometimes, and you're like, oh my, this is literally quicker than me going to the store and getting it at some points. And you're like, okay, this is.
But the other part that's really important is America. If you look at its innovation structure, and I mean, there's bad parts in the book that I mentioned, that there's things that are downsides. Like, I sound like I'm being overly praiseworthy, and I think there's a lot to praise, far more than for other countries. But there are dark spots. So just want to make sure that people don't think I'm trying to paint an overly rosy view. But the key of the matter is that one of the things that really matters in the U.S. is the insanely high protection of property rights. And this has a weird paradox as an effect, is it allows people who innovate to capture a larger share of the benefits of innovation. But in the same time, because it does so, it also increases the amount of benefits that the innovation generates, because it incentivizes them to do a lot more. So this is a point I end up making in the book, is one of the great things about the United States is that its markets favor innovation, entry, and contestability of incumbents so much that you get huge gains at the bottom, and the gains are more directed towards the poor because of the other mechanisms I mentioned. And this ties to the larger contribution to theory that I'm trying to do in the book. Is the first one is, there's a very famous theory in economics called the Kuznets curve. It's been rebranded for in the environment and other stuff, but it essentially says that as countries grow richer, they will have rising inequality, and then past a certain point, they will have declining inequality. And the pattern is very well observed for a lot of countries. But the point I make is that actually this curve only exists if you have high friction markets, because it relies on the idea that, for example, if you're a person, the cities are industrializing, the wage in the cities are really high, the person who goes first makes inequality go up just because he gets the higher wages, and that's it. But that's a story where the other people cannot move to the city very easily. There has to be friction for this to happen. But if the world is frictionless, to go at an extreme, all the workers go to the high wage city, right? Or at least until wages equalize across city and countryside. But then the story is, so what determines the friction? And people tend to think natural barriers, distance, information. But the reality is, a large share of the problem is institutions that limit people's ability to move easily between industries. And the point I make in the book is the United States is not void of friction, but it has so much fewer frictions than other countries, like Britain, for example, where, for example, servants, if you left employment as domestics, it was a criminal breach. It wasn't just like a breach of contract. It was criminalizable offense. There's a famous paper by Suresh Naidu on this. who points that out. So if you limit people's ability to move between markets, that creates friction. You're going to get the Kuznets curve because of that. But if you have very open markets, the Kuznets curve gets stomped because there's no friction. So you basically like have the construction equipment, like the roller that like stamps the street. Well, you have that rolls over the Kuznets curve, and that's the point of the book. Is actually the correct way to understand the Kuznets curve is as high friction markets. And the United States didn't have these frictions, which is why in that period you get huge gains in income and no increase in inequality.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I mean, basically, what you're describing is one of history's biggest social mobility booms. And obviously, me and you have done a lot of work on social mobility, and we talk about like just what you said at the end: institutions, economic freedom, like barriers to entry, reducing those barriers to entry, and having more options for people. So, what does that era of America teach, or what can we learn from that for like modern mobility researchers who mostly focus on things, like education and infrastructure, which are obviously important, but aren't, are missing big pieces like we touched on in our work?
So, actually, the way to answer that is by looking at blacks and whites in the same period. So, in the US, the blacks are converging, okay, but they're converging from a really low level, like from their incomes being roughly 15 to 20% of the average white, which is like a huge gap, but gradually collapsing to 30 to 40%. And the point I make in the book is actually there is convergence, but there is nothing close to what you observe in terms of social mobility for whites. So if you look at whites, markets are really good at pushing them up. Blacks in the US in that period get some gains in income mobility, but not as much. And they don't exhibit as high levels of income mobility. And the point I make in the book is this is both a testimony to the strength of markets and an indictment of how governments can stomp on them. Because if you look at the history in the US of why there would have been what little convergence was observed, it mostly happened by people trying to leave counties. So there's a famous guy in the US, I'm going to say his name because his name is hilarious. His name was Peg Leg Williams. And his job was entirely as a guy who would go around as a headhunting firm. And he'd hire thousands of African Americans to move to places where wages were higher. And he'd basically be a placement firm. That's what he was doing in practice. It's the 19th century version of this. And he would just move them to higher wages. People in the U.S. South hated him for a reason. He went to jail multiple times for violating laws that said, and the reason why these laws were enacted is some employers in the South didn't like to have wages bidden up by this competitive pressure. But this guy was there and continually tried and sometimes very subversively attacked those laws and got people's higher wages. But that's actually a testimony to the point I make about markets, is actually what little, because then there were laws enacted. I should add this detail. There were laws enacted preventing guys like Pegleg to do this kind of stuff where you're providing these services to match people to better, higher paying job, thus creating labor market competition, which is probably the best thing that people can have. Free labor markets are the most like important things to greater income mobility. But there are laws that are enacted against vagrancy, against immigration agents, people who try to recruit, or recruitment laws they're called, and they end up hurting blacks. But whatever challenge was made to them happened through market forces. So in a way, market forces mitigated any of the damages that norms that people had or racial prejudice that were embedded as social norms and racial prejudice embedded in law, these were mitigated by market forces. So the kind of point I make is, imagine if America's market economy had not been as open and frictionless as it was. There'd been like other barriers to mobility, other monopoly rights given to firms, other barriers to challenges for incumbent firms. Whatever the effect of segregation laws in the US would have been massively magnified. So in a way, this acted like as a mitigating force. And in terms of today's lesson, it gives you like a powerful story is the United States, for the group that wasn't legally discriminated, had massive income mobility across generations. And the group that had less income mobility, whatever it got because of markets.
Yeah.
So that's a testimony to how much you could do if you let people move between places, if you let them migrate from places with bad policies to good policies, if you let them move between industries that are declining to places where industries are rising, you let them leave what economist Land Pritchett calls zombie places.
Yeah.
You let them move to dynamic places. You get huge gains in living standards because of that, but you also get income mobility. So, and this goes back to the point is, I'm not saying there aren't structural underlying stories of why income mobility can be transmitted across generations, where, yeah, people who are rich have somewhat of a head start. But the thing that really, really has an effect in terms of pushing people up is not initial advantage, it's an open field. And this is why I'm saying markets are insanely pro-egalitarian. They're an insanely egalitarian force. And let them freer, and you'll actually get more social mobility, more income mobility, more educational mobility, more geographic mobility. And in the end, you'll get massive improvements for people at the bottom. And all the other stuff that people are trying to focus on, it's not that they're wrong in terms of the sign that goes to it, but they're wrong about the size of the coefficient they get. There is nothing that beats market forces or open market forces in terms of promoting income mobility and economic growth for the poor.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I completely agree. Obviously, I am in full-fledged agreement on everything there. And I think that reminds me of one piece in your book that I thought was interesting. And correct me if I'm not making the argument correctly, but so you argue that America resisted, a strong welfare state for decades during that time, precisely because markets were already delivering broad-based gains. And they only built one after it slowed down after during World War One. So is that like a markets first then safety net argument, something more specific to that moment? Because this is something that at least personally always bothers me about, and obviously we have an op-ed about this and a piece about this, but that argued against some of the arguments from people like Piketty or Hickel, who argue that other countries should just follow the Nordic model of redistribution, but they want to skip the steps and get the order incorrectly. Because countries, at least in my mind, need to get rich first before they have that pool of resources to distribute. And they reject, anyway, many of the institutions that made Nordic countries rich in the first place. Because again, I'll repeat this for the 100th time, Nordic countries are not socialist. They are market economies with large welfare states.
So I don't think I agree with that way of saying it. For the reason that you look at Europe in that period, you find that welfare states are emerging, even though people at the bottom get some gains. Okay, so they get some gains at the bottom. But the story here is that I try to emphasize is that sometimes one of the things that happens with economic growth is because economic growth largely stems from innovation, and innovation is an act of rebellion against an established order. That means that innovation is highly disruptive. And you need to find a way when you have disruptions to compensate the losers. And most justifications for welfare states come from we want to help people who are dislocated out of jobs or et cetera, et cetera. And I understand the argument, I understand the pitch. But the story is if you have really fast innovation, really fast economic growth that is really broad-based, then that compensation of the losers happens through a variety of mechanisms rather than through putting all your eggs in one basket. Which is why, by the way, I tend to think that the argument that the welfare state doesn't slow down economic growth a lot, I think is actually correct. But it's because it's putting the causality backwards. Is people don't feel they need the welfare state unless they believe that growth is too slow. So you're getting kind of an endogeneity problem that pops up is people really like to have higher incomes, right? I don't think it's a radical statement. But if you get really fast economic growth and you get high income mobility, your demand for the welfare state is massively lower. You don't want it. You're not as interested in it because it doesn't do much for you. Because you might be the rich guy tomorrow, in which case you're going to be paying for it, which you're not really
Yeah.
fond of. But at the same time, you also know that, look, what is it going to do? Is it going to change that much? Is it going to, like, look, I'm going to get 6% wage increase next year anyways. So, like,
Yeah.
and this is the point that I end up making is the US, it did have like parts of a welfare state that emerged, but nowhere on the scale of any other country in the world. The only other one, by the way, that has a slow emergence of the welfare state is Canada, and Canada is a close second to the U.S. in terms of egalitarian growth. So it gets close to egalitarian growth, so it has some rises in inequality, but it has smaller increases. So even in the ranking of which speed of the welfare state you get relative to the how egalitarian was growth, really explains a lot of the pattern. And I have follow-up work that I want to do on this. And there's that extra little kick here is it actually also explains very well why socialism never picked up in the US, is because of that episode of really fast growth. People understood that the US, and there's a famous book in economic demography on this by Michael Haynes, says there was never a class divide in the US. There was a racial divide for sure, but there was never a class divide between people, and he leaves it there. But if you realize, that makes sense that there'd be no class divide. If income mobility is really high, people see statuses as being changeable. And so you don't demand as much distribution, and you probably don't have as much resentment for other groups, and that makes for a smaller market for socialism to emerge. And so one of the points that I end up making in the book, there's a famous work by Marx and Lipset that they point out that, one of the reasons socialism, so the book is called "It Didn't Happen Here," which is saying socialism never picked up in the US, and they're making a history of it. And they have a chapter dedicated to economic growth for the bottom, and they're using all this old data, and they say that was a strong contributing force. And my point is, no, you guys underestimated how important this was. You're right in the argument. It didn't happen here because the poor got massively better off, and they enjoyed strong social mobility. Well, they had even more than you realize. So their argument is even stronger, and explains why there isn't an outright, well, maybe now there is, but there isn't an outright in 1920 strong socialist party in the United States like there is in France, where the SFIO and the PCF are very strong parties, the SDP in Germany, the socialists in Italy just before Mussolini snuffs them out, the Labour Party in Britain. The reason why America never has until, and not only that, even the socialists today in the United States work as very vocal elements inside coalitions. But even as in terms of broad popularity, they still haven't stuck. And my point is actually that's not hard to explain. If you have really fast economic growth at the bottom, the demand for these ideas collapses. And it's only when you have growth slowdowns that socialism picks up, welfare policies. And I'm not making, like, I mean, I like to diss socialists. I don't hide it, but here I'm making it purely descriptive, as it's less popular when there is economic growth, same way that welfare state policies are far less popular when growth is rapid. So it explains the timing of the US being a latecomer to the welfare state. It explains the lack of popularity for very long periods of time in the US with respect to socialism, largely because markets were doing what socialists were promising, a more egalitarian world.
No, yeah, I think that those, you made very good important distinctions there that I hadn't made in my questions. I think that was really interesting. So, kind of broad base about the book. What do you think we can take from the book? Again, going back to your earlier comment at the beginning of, doing economic history well to inform things about today. How can we take this book and apply it to conversations about growth, inequality, mobility today? Like, what are some lessons we can learn from history that will tell us, okay, what things went, what things we should, do more of, do less of, avoid.
So in the book at the end, I try to make a distinction between redistribution and intervention. You don't need to have if you want a more egalitarian society and think policies are needed, like schooling or stuff like that, that's redistribution. That's not the same as intervention. The case for redistribution, or what is a basic welfare state, is a more contestable case where nuances are very numerous, and thus, like, you have to start discussing policy by policy, aspect by aspect. And if you're being honest, it's a more laborious conversation. However, when it comes to interventions, regulation, barriers to entry, tariffs, occupational licensing, zoning regulation, anything that blocks people from moving between markets or between places or between industries, that is like the equivalent to economics to what climate change says about, like, is global warming caused by humans? Yes. Like, it's like there's no way you can argue with a straight face that globally these occupational licensing helps the poor, that tariffs help the poor, that that protected monopolies or cartels where governments provide barriers to entry to protect incumbent firms, that government subsidies to industries are not regressive. The case for this is insanely strong and far more even-handed, far more one-handed, in the sense that, yeah, we all agree this is what it is, and higher level of confidence, maybe less on, like, the size, but definitely on the direction. So my argument is, start de-intervening. Start, like, rip occupational licensing apart. Remove childcare service regulations that have, in any case, very little to do, largely because it helps mothers value their human capital more, return on the job market faster. It allows for specialization. It actually incentivizes people from acquiring skills. You deregulate housing. In fact, I think the one silver bullet is massive deregulation of housing in the United States, which would allow people to move between places. I mean, at the risk of, like, promoting our own research here, we have actually a paper on this in European Journal of Political Economy, where you and I work on what we call Bullmo's migrants, which refer to the idea that people move to area where there's productive entrepreneurship. But one of the points we make in the paper that gets, I think, is the one people ignored when we were trying to push it forward, is that if people can move to places where there is better policy but also more productive entrepreneurs, it's the same as if you improve policy in all places. Because if you depopulate the area with shit policies, i.e. California, and people move to places with better policy, i.e. Virginia, Texas, Tennessee, Florida, no dissing California. I'm sorry. It's ingrained in me to diss California a little.
I like how you just kind of threw Virginia in there,
there's a reason,
because you live there. Yeah,
I have to make myself believe that Virginia is not middle of the pack. But if people can move from bad policy to good policy, even though no one's policies has changed, the effective weight of policy has improved because people have gone to the better places. So if you allow this people to be more mobile, to have more competition between jurisdiction, and people can leave to move to the places with better opportunity, what you'll end up with is far more income mobility. So I would say start disintervening, start picking the biggest policies possible on the de-intervention side. The welfare stuff, I think there's issue, Social Security, but from the book, you don't have a strong case on these. They provide a stronger case that open markets, contestable markets, permissionless innovation can rip apart barriers that exist to people climbing up the income ladder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, again, I guess this is one issue with having someone you agree with and a good friend on, is that, yeah, I agree. I have nothing else to further add. I will end my questions on books with not even really a question unless there's something you want to add. I just think it's an interesting fact that is worth noting, which is in Chapter 8, you show that the average incomes of the bottom 90% of Americans was higher than the GDP per capita of almost every country on Earth at the time. And even if you look today, that is true. Obviously, other countries have caught up, and there are countries who are doing really well. But still, the vast majority of countries, the bottom 90% on average, are doing much better than the average person in insert, almost any country, right?
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, is there anything you want to add there or
Yeah.
anything?
Plus
I
another
just think
one.
it's an interesting fact.
The U.S. has a really small welfare state relative to other nations. I mean, it doesn't have a small one, but it has a smaller one than, say, France. But because the U.S. is so insanely richer, if you think the mission of the welfare state is poverty eradication, the U.S. is massively better at this simply because it has so much more resources to pull people out of absolute poverty. And so if you look at the cumulative sum of private welfare, public welfare, employer provided services in the form of welfare, despite having a welfare state around 32% of GDP versus France as 58%, the US actually spends more per capita in terms of welfare than France does. So it tells you a story that, look, of all the places where you would want to be poor, you would prefer that to be in the US. But also, if you fall down on your luck and you just need to get above a certain line where your basic needs are met, again, America.
And this is from a Canadian. This isn't even someone who's biased.
Oh, yeah. Like other Canadians will crucify me for this. I will be hanged upon my return.
Lightning round, which is just quick, short questions. If you have your Mount Rushmore of economist, so just the top four economists.
I thought about that. When you sent me the question, I thought about this. I wanted you to ask this one. I was like, oh, please ask this one. So Bob Fogel, Douglas North, Ronald Coase, Friedrich Hayek, and Simon Kuznets.
Okay, that was 5, but we'll give you a pass. You're not from the U.S., so you don't know about Mount Rushmore. That's okay.
But it's because I count them by Nobel. So I cheated. Since Fogel and North won on the same one, I count them as one.
Count as one? Yeah. So, okay, so that's fair enough.
So it's technically 4 Nobels that I put on the Mount Rushmore.
A co-author of yours that you want to highlight, or maybe a grad student or a set of grad students that you just want to highlight for people who are watching and are just interested in the work?
I would say, look, it's hard to pick a student that above others, largely because I like working with them all. So I'm going to pick the most recent 2 that I have just out of this that I think people should know. One of them is Charles Remian, who's my student here at George Mason, who is doing really good work on family and economics. So he's going on the market this year, which is why I advertise him. I thought about this. And Charles is actually doing work notably on fertility in Cuba after the revolution. And him and the other student I'm going to mention, they were going to go with the title Seizing the Means of Reproduction, which is a great name. I wanted another name to reflect the result, which is that actually fertility increased after the takeover of the communists. But I wanted to call it f***ing commies because it's actually descriptive. It's actually a descriptive statement. I just want to point out that bleeped F word is actually descriptive because they are indeed doing the F thing by having more babies. So it's actually not an insult. It's not even rude. It's actually a pure description. So, but they thought that it was better to go on the market without the F word. And I agreed, even though I thought it was less fun. So that's the first student. The other one is his co-author on this, which is Carlos Martinez, who's a Cuban student. He's going on the market next year. But he is doing work with me on Cuba as well, but also on economic inequality, where we have a modelized version of some of the things we said about the book, where he and I are working together on this. And I'll mention the last one, Patrick Crawford, who is also on the market this year. Actually, I have 4 more students on the market this year. Crap. I realized. So there's Patrick Crawford, who's doing really good work on media and economics, and Alex Surik, who is doing really good work on regulatory economics, notably with me on the origins of regulations. So if the 4 people I want you to know are my 4 students that you should hire, and you would be very smart to hire them because they're really good. And I had every one of their flaws is entirely my fault. That's what I pointed out. I only damaged them. That's what happened.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of them, Carlos is the only one I know, and yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think your most recent working paper with him that just came out, "Dirty Commies,"
Yes.
and the effect of the revolution on emissions is one of my favorite papers I've read this year, and two, the best title I've read, maybe of all time. So I think it's great.
I'm so happy. I'm so happy about that title. It's I honestly, when we started the paper, 90% of the reason I thought this was a great paper to do was the title.
That's reasonable. Yeah. Sometimes you guys start with the title and then
that was fun.
then figure out the paper. So last question. Of the 120 or so peer-reviewed papers that you have, which one do you think is the most underappreciated that you would want to highlight?
I would say that there is an article that I wrote with Raymond March in research policy on lobotomies of all things. And the point we make is that there was a big boom in lobotomies at the end of the 1940s, even though the practice had been discredited by researchers for a few decades by that point as a regulator of the behavior of patients. And what we were trying to figure out is, why doesn't it die as soon as people realize this? Why did it take so long for the practice to disappear? And one of the things we noticed is it actually disappeared faster in private asylums than it did in public asylums. And we started understanding the incentives inside public asylums. And the answer was, it's the incentives inside the public sector were far less geared towards responding fast to innovations regarding mental care. And thus the practice lasted longer and ended up with far more controversies and damages made to patients. I think that's the paper that's mostly underappreciated. But here I will point out one last thing. That paper, Ray brought me in on it to help him finish it, but the core idea was Ray's, and so he deserves the lion's share of the credit. But I think our joint work has been massively underappreciated on this one. It's the paper, I think, that kicks ass the most that I've done.
Yeah. No, I do like that paper. I had two that I was going to say on your behalf, and one a little self-indulging, because I do think our political economy of Lighthouse's paper is great, really interesting, and my wife now loves me again because I no longer have 20 Lighthouse books hanging around the house when I was collecting the data. And the second, I would say, is your paper with Steve Horwitz on inequality. The difference, it's all inequality created equally, and the answer is no. There's good inequality, there's bad inequality, and that's a paper that I read in grad school that really kind of flipped the switch for me and really changed the way I think about this, and made me more interested in looking into inequality and mobility. So I love that paper.
I love it too, but I don't love it as much as the lobotomies one. The lobotomies holds a particular spot in my heart for me, largely because my family comes from the psychology background. Mm-hmm. And it's like kind of topic that touches my heartstrings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a beautiful note to end on. Vincent, thank you so much for being here.
Cheers.
Always a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks to Vincent Geloso for a great conversation with the From Ideas to Innovation podcast, where we bring together innovators, academics, and policymakers. And thank you for listening. If you like this episode, please drop a comment below, check out the show notes on Substack, and please like and subscribe this episode.